we are going to touch on Tish Jul, of course, which is coming up. And if we have a little time, we'll get to the parsha too. There is a custom some people have on Tish Jul to study the Gemara in Maseches Gittin, which talks about the prelude to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And I'd like to read you a few lines. Rabbi Yochanan, what is the meaning of the following verse? Ashrei Adam mefachei tamid. Happy is the person who is always fearful. He's always worried about what might happen. Umakshev libo, a person who hardens his heart. Meaning, he's oblivious to what may happen. Yipol bara, he will fall in a bad way. So there's a virtue of being concerned with the future and not being a person who, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and whatever the consequences are, forget it. So the Gemara says that there are three stories to illustrate this point, but it will suffice with one. Akamtzu bar kamtzu char Yerushalayim. One illustration of this point is the famous story of how Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, these two people, one was named Kamtza, the other Bar Kamtza, brought about the destruction of Yerushalayim. So one tells the story. There was a man, the Rachmei Kamtza. He had a friend named Kamtza. Ubal debave Bar Kamtza. His enemy was Bar Kamtza. So one day the man made a party. He told his servant, Zil Aisli Kamsa, go bring me Kamsa. In those days there was no post, no mail. So if you wanted to extend an invitation, you sent a messenger. So go invite my friend Kamsa. So the messenger made a mistake. Also Aisli Bar Kamsa. He went and brought Bar Kamsa instead, who of course was the person's enemy. So also the host came. He saw that who's sitting in his party? This person was his bitter enemy. Amrlei, so he goes over to the person and says, Michti, let's see what's going on over here. Hahu gabra bal debavidu gabrahu. You are my enemy. My boy Esacha. What are you doing here? I mean, you should have enough common sense to realize it was a mistake. Why did you come? So, Kun Pike, get up and go, leave. Amrlei, so he answered, listen, since I came already, you're going to embarrass me, I'm going to leave in the middle. Shavkan, let me stay. I'll pay you, I'll pay for my meal. Whatever I eat and drink, I'll pay. I understand you shouldn't have to pay for me. I'll pay whatever I eat and drink. Amrlei lo, so the host said, no, not enough. Amrlei, so he said, just don't embarrass me, I'll pay for half of the whole meal. Amrlei lo. Amrlei, so he said, I'll pay for the whole meal. I just wanted to know, by the way, that, I've made chasna. Hopefully my other children will get married. Anybody who wants to pay for the whole thing can come, I don't care who he is. My worst enemy, you willing to pay? No problem. But this person didn't want. So Nakte biyade, he took him with his hand. He stood him up. And threw him out. It's a humiliation. So the man said, Bar Kamsa said, there were rabbis sitting there. They didn't protest. I was humiliated. So Shema Mino Kanichlu. So it must be that they acquiesce. They had no objection. So Ezo Echelu Kurtzvei Malka. I'm going to go and slander them in front of the Roman Caesar. I'm going to slander the Jews. So he went. So Amar Lakay, so he told the Caesar, Marta B'cha Yehudai, the Jews have rebelled against you. So the Caesar said, Me'emar, who says? How do you know? So he proposed a test. Amalai, so he said, Shadlu Kurbana, send them an offering, send them an animal to be brought as a sacrifice in the temple. And Chazas, you'll see, if they bring it or not. If they bring it, that means they're faithful. If they refuse to bring it, that means they've rebelled. So, Ozal, the Caesar went, he sends a very fine calf. But how did it cause? But as they were traveling, Shoda Beimuma, Bar Kamsa put a blemish, Benivs Vasayim, either in the lip, Varmelo, and some say Bedukin Shebe'ayin, one of the membranes of the eye. It was such a blemish, Duchte, who was in a place, we would consider that a blemish that would invalidate the sacrifice. But the Romans would not have considered that a blemish. In their temples, that would have been a perfectly fine animal. So the Caesar would not have understood why the Jews refused to bring it. So, the big problem, what to do? So, the Rabbanan thought that even though as a rule you can't bring a blemished animal, and the Torah says explicitly, even if it's a Gentile who is sending the sacrifice, it's also prohibited, but they wanted to make an exception for Shalom Malchus, for good relations with the government. Now, why would good relations with the government permit committing a sin? So you have to understand that sometimes Shalom Malchus could result in a pikuach nefesh situation. When you're on the government's bad side, it may result in a pogrom or some other action against Jews, which would entail a loss of life, and therefore it's considered pikuach nefesh. So Amru B'Schai ben Avkulas. So B'Schai ben Avkulas said, Yomru Balei Mumen crave from the Gabim Mizbeach. We can't do that, because then people will say that blemished animals are valid for sacrifices. We wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want this misconception that people should think that the halacha is that blemished animals are valid. So several amikdalet loleis of alema. So they thought, okay, so let's kill Bar Kamsa. He shouldn't go back and report to the Caesar. I mean, he's a rodaif. He's really acting in a manner that will bring death upon the community. So therefore, we're justified in killing him. B'Schai ben Avkulas said no. Yomu, people will say, Matal mum b'kach meharek. They'll say that we killed him not because he's endangering the Jews. They're going to say we killed him because he blemished the sacrifice. And people will say that the punishment for causing a defect in a sacrifice is death, which is not the case. So therefore, it's also a misconception. So therefore, he didn't allow them to do anything. So they brought the sacrifice, and they didn't kill Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa went and informed the Jews to the Caesar. The Caesar then sent the general upon Yerushalayim, and one thing led to the next. Ultimately, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Some Rabbi Yochanan, and the sanuso shel B'Schai ben Avkulas, the tolerance of B'Schai ben Avkulas, his willingness to tolerate the situation, hechriva beisenu, it caused our temple to be destroyed, the sarf v'sechalenu, and the hechel to be burnt, the iglisanu ne'artzenu, and caused the exile from the land. Okay, what's the point of the story? What's the point of the story? So everyone that reads the story and is forced to give commentary to the story says the point of the story is this. We know from the Gemara Maseches Yuma. The Gemara Maseches Yuma says the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed for the three Averos, the three cardinal sins of idolatry, murder, and incest. Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim. The second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed for the sin of sinas chinam, unjustified hatred of fellow Jews. And the Gemara says, Maseches Yuma, you see from here, that sinas chinam is as severe as the other three Averos. It's just as severe as murder, incest, and idolatry all rolled into one. Which probably means, not that it's as severe, I think idolatry and incest and murder probably are worse than sinas chinam, but it means that in their power to bring destruction, in their power to destroy the Beis Hamikdash, it's just as severe. In the same way that those three could bring about the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, the second could bring about the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Okay, that's what the Gemara seems to say. So what does the Gemara tell us? That the second Beis Hamikdash, the one that was destroyed by the Romans, was destroyed for sinas chinam. Well, this story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa is a beautiful illustration of sinas chinam. You have a guy sitting by your house. You don't like him that much. So, okay, you don't like him. You're not pleased. But that justifies picking him up, throwing him out, humiliating him. Such an embarrassment. That's unjustified hatred. That's sinas chinam. So most people learn this Gemara, they think that's the point of the Gemara. The Gemara is giving an illustration of sinas chinam. Is that pshat in the Gemara? Is that the correct interpretation of the Gemara or not? What would you say?
I think it's only part of the story.
Pardon?
It's only half a story. That's not...
No, but is that the point the Gemara is making? Is the Gemara making a point about sinas chinam, about gratuitous, unnecessary, unjustified hatred? Well, let's ask ourselves. In this Gemara, who is the villain? Bottom line, who is the villain of the story? Bar Kamsa? What is Rabbi Yochanan's verdict? When Rabbi Yochanan sums up the story, who does he blame for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash?
The rabbi.
The rabbi, not Bar Kamsa. He doesn't say that it's Bar Kamsa's fault. He doesn't say that it's the host's fault. He says it's the fault of Reb Chaim ben Avkulas, because if he would have allowed them to bring the carbon, or if he would have allowed them to kill Bar Kamsa, the problem would have been solved. So the problem is Reb Chaim ben Avkulas. He's the villain of the story, so to speak. That's what Rabbi Yochanan's verdict is. That on the sanus of his tolerance, his willingness to bear the situation, brought about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. But more than that,
Is that rabbi that you just mentioned, is he also the one that sat at the meal and tolerated Bar Kamsa tossed out?
I'll tell you a very interesting thing. I'm glad you asked that question. The Gemara doesn't say it explicitly. The Gemara says there were rabbis there. It doesn't say he was one of them. But in fact, the story is repeated in the Medrash Rabbah on Megillas Eicha, and there it says Reb Chaim ben Avkulas was the rabbi that was there. Now this is a fact which the Gemara seems to conceal and the Medrash seems to reveal. So it doesn't seem that the Gemara is going that way. The Gemara seems to be emphasizing his later role in the story, not the earlier role in the story. Yes?
But there could have been yet one more level of trying to save Israel by the rabbis, since they realized the plot here. They could have gone to Caesar as a group and saying, by the way, this is what happened.
Yeah, that also may be true. That also may be true. Right? But let me just take it a step further. Go back to the beginning of the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan introduced the entire discussion with a verse from the book of Proverbs. And the whole story is a commentary to the verse. It's an illustration of the verse. And what is the point of the verse? The verse has nothing to do with hatred. Nothing to do with love of fellow Jews. It has to do with being oblivious to the consequences of your actions. It says, Ashrei Adam Mefachei Tamid. Happy is the person who's always fearful. Meaning, before he does something, he always thinks, what will happen if I do this? What can come out of it? Like, if I do this, what will the reaction be? What will they do? Well, that's how he thinks. Well, if a person is makshali, well, if a person hardens his heart, meaning I'm determined, I'm doing X no matter what happens. I don't care what the results, what the consequences will be. This is what I'm doing. Then that person yipol bara. So the entire discussion of the Gemara has nothing to do with sinas chinam. It has to do with looking ahead, anticipating consequences, or not anticipating consequences. So Rabbi Yochanan says the person who's mefachei tamid, who's always fearful, meaning he anticipates what possible negative consequences might emerge, that person is a fortunate person, is a lucky person. The person who hardens his heart and is oblivious, he's clueless, doesn't think about the consequences, that person will fall in a bad way. And this story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa is an illustration of that. Why? So who is the person who didn't look ahead? Was Reb Chaim ben Avkulas. Right? If he would have thought of the consequences, he would have thought that perhaps his action, the position he would take, will bring about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. He would have made different decisions. So therefore, he's the poster boy, so to speak, for this point.
So was he on the Beit Din, or did we hear anything about him?
However the community was organized at the time, he was in a decision-making position. Let's put it that way. That's clear from the Gemara. I don't know But this time, if there was a functioning Sanhedrin, if there wasn't a functioning Sanhedrin, but he was apparently in a leadership position. Yeah.
I just have to say, a reasonable man, I don't think could foresee this kind of a result.
So let's think about this for a second.
And what about the host? He also didn't think ahead.
It's interesting. That's true. That's true. He didn't think ahead. But the Gemara doesn't seem to blame him. It almost seems to say like this. Chazal say this. Chazal say that it's a medrash of Tanu B'Elio that Ezeu Chacham, who is truly wise. Now, so in Pirkei Avos it says the person who's truly wise is a lomed mikol adam, person who learns from every man. But in Tanu B'Elio it says who is truly wise. Haraya Esenailad. Right? A person who sees what is going to happen. So a wise person can anticipate the future. So it could be that the expectation of being able to see in the future, Reb Chaim ben Kulas is held responsible. The host might also have been mistaken in the same way, but we don't have the same demands of him. It's an interesting story that the Brisker Rav, who was the son of Reb Chaim Brisker, said a very funny thing. He was comparing himself to his father. He says that my father had such foresight, he could tell you what the consequences of an act would be 10 years in the future.
Oh, yeah.
He says, I can't do that. He says, but I can tell you what the consequences are now. How much even I can tell you. Anyway, so this is what the Gemara says. Let's talk about consequences. Let's understand the Gemara. 2 points from the Gemara. You see, we, religious Jews, are accustomed to thinking of things in a certain way. And the Gemara is telling us that we're making a mistake. As we take the other Gemara, the Gemara I mentioned in Maseches Yuma, which says like this, that the first base of English was destroyed for the 3 Averas of idolatry, incest, and murder. The second base of English was destroyed for the sin of sinas chinam, or unjustified hatred. So we tend to think like this, that really, if we wouldn't have sinned, then the base of English would not have been destroyed. And because we sinned, the base of English was destroyed, which seems to be the point the Gemara is making. So the cause of the Churban, the cause of the destruction is sin. Our Gemara is telling us that it's not so simple. It's not so simple. Things don't just happen by themselves. Historical events have historical causes. So therefore you have to understand the other Gemara in this way. If the Ribono Shel Olam would be pleased with our conduct, had we not sinned, then the Ribono Shel Olam would protect us from the negative consequences of our actions. In other words, if God is pleased with you, if He's happy with you, you can make serious mistakes and you won't suffer the consequences of your mistakes. And sometimes you know that. We make mistakes, and despite the fact we made a clear mistake, whatever we touch turned to gold. I mean, halavaya from your gezak, but it happens sometimes. So you wonder, to those people that it happens, why does it happen? Some reason God is happy with them. So therefore, they can't, they make the most foolish decision, the most ridiculous decision, and all of a sudden, tremendous success. Why? Because the Ribono Shel Olam is pleased with them, for some reason. But if HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not pleased, so then you will suffer the consequences of your mistakes. But if you wouldn't make mistakes, if you're more cautious, maybe you could save yourself. That's what the Gemara is telling us. Then when we say that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because of Jewish sin, that is true. Had we not committed the sin, God would have protected us from ourselves. He would have protected us from our mistakes. But because we committed sin, we lost the siyata d'shmaya, we lost the divine assistance, and now we will suffer the consequences of our mistakes. So both are true. In other words, the Churban is a consequence of Jewish sin, but it's also a consequence of Jewish error. If we would not have committed the error, then the Churban wouldn't have come. Had we not committed the sin, even if we committed the error, the Churban wouldn't have come. God would have protected us from the consequences of our errors. But because we've sinned, so we've lost the divine protection, therefore we suffer the consequences of our mistakes, yes?
That sounds a bit of a circular argument. Why wouldn't he be pleased with us? It must be because we sin.
No, yeah, so the sin has nothing to do with lack of foresight. The sin has to do with sinas chinam, Rabbi Eliezer, whatever the sin is. Not the Gemara Numa discusses. Whatever the sin is. That's the sin. Now, once you commit sin, so now God no longer will protect you. So don't make any mistakes. Be very careful not to make any mistakes. Because if you make mistakes, God isn't going to protect you.
Political type of mistake.
Political mistakes or
more sin.
And not looking both ways when you cross the street, or those types of things.
Not necessarily sin, more sin.
Not sin mistakes. Mistakes of prudence, safety, political calculations. Right? But that's the point. In other words, if you are a tzaddik gomer, if you're absolutely righteous, God will protect you. You won't forget. Your mistakes will be irrelevant. If you make mistakes, God will protect you. Right? And we know all those stories about people that made bad investments and all of a sudden, a friend just told me a story yesterday, day before yesterday, that his father passed away, and he and his two siblings inherited some fairly worthless stock in a utility company in Ohio. So his two siblings who were a little more business-minded sold the stock for very, very small amounts of money. It wasn't really worth that much money. And he, not being so business-minded, just ignored it, just sat on it. And then what happened was that particular utility, you may remember 10 years ago there was a big regional blackout.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It affected us. So it was determined that the cause of the blackout started from that utility company. So the stockholders, so some aggressive lawyers, decided to launch a class action suit of the stockholders against the management of the company because they didn't fulfill their fiduciary responsibility to conduct the company properly, and so on and so forth. So they were looking for a person to be the first plaintiff in this class action suit. So they were looking for someone who owned some shares in this company. And they found this guy. Right? So in the class action suit, he was the first plaintiff. The second plaintiff was the Teachers Union of Louisiana. The entire pension fund of the Teachers Union, which had hundreds of thousands of shares. And he had, a small number of shares, but they found him first, so he was listed as the first plaintiff.
Wow.
And sure enough, the lawyers, fought this suit, and he made $10,000.
Not bad.
Right, that was his share of the settlement of the class action suit. Now, he obviously made a mistake, right? Because if he would have been smart, he wouldn't have been so clueless. He would have sold the stock, and it would have made $300. Right? But because he was such a batlon, as they say, so not on top of his affairs, he just sat on this worthless stock, he made $10,000. So the point is that if a Kadosh Baruch Hu is pleased with you, you can make mistakes, and He'll protect you from your mistakes, and your mistakes will turn into causes for success. But if Hashem is not pleased with you, you commit sin, then you have to be very careful. Don't make any mistakes, because God will not protect you from your mistakes. So it's true what the Gemara Yuma says. At the time of the Churban Bayesheni, they committed terrible sins. Sinas chinam, unjustified hatred. It's a terrible sin. But that itself would not have brought about the destruction. But why was there a destruction? Because somebody didn't look at consequences. And therefore, this is an illustration of this idea. Ashrei adam mafachei tamid. Happy is the person who's always fearful. Okay, that's the first level. But let's go deeper. And this is something which is very, very, very important. Very important to understand. Reb Chaim ben Akulas, was he the type of person who did not think of consequences?
Yeah, he was thinking of consequences. Something if we do this, then they might think this.
No, to the contrary, he thought of consequences. Right? He was a mafachei tamid. He said, listen, he says, we can't bring this carbon. Because if we bring this carbon as an exceptional case because of government relations, there'll be a terrible consequence. What is the consequence? People are going to say that an animal that's blemished can be brought on the altar. So then they propose, well, let's kill Bar Kamsa. He says, no, can't do that. Why? Because then people will say that a person who puts a blemish in an animal is liable for the death penalty. Can't do that. So B'schai ben Avkulas is not a person who is clueless. He is not a person who is oblivious to consequences. To the contrary, he thinks about consequences.
What
So
consequences he thought of were wrong? Like maybe they weren't
no,
consequences.
more than that. I think the consequences were right. But what was the mistake? So what was the error?
There were more important issues.
There are more important issues. In other words, sometimes we think of the consequences only within our little box. Within our little box, there are consequences. But there's a bigger picture out there. Well, let me give you an example. Don't tell anybody I gave this example, because I'm going to shoot myself in the foot in a way that you'll see in a moment.
You realize this camera's on.
Well, you know, they always can cut this piece out. Now, let's think about the following question. You know that the Jewish Federation gives funding for Jewish schools in Toronto, really to subsidize tuitions. You know, tuition is very high in Jewish schools, and the schools like to give scholarships, so the Federation subsidizes this. Now, it does this on the basis of basically need. In other words, there's a formula of what parents could be expected to pay. There's the school's full tuition. There's a shortfall. There's a mathematical formula by which the subsidies are allocated. Now, bigger school gets more, smaller school gets less, and so on and so forth. And it's very nice. It's very nice. You know, let's say I'm a parent of children in the system, and I get a tuition subsidy. If the Federation wasn't subsidizing tuitions, the school would probably try to twist my arm a little bit harder and squeeze more money out of me. So it's a kindness. It's a very nice thing that the Federation subsidizes tuitions. Now the school will be a little more kind when they deal with me. Sounds good? Well, let's think for a second. If you look at the broader picture, you know, the Breitowitz family is going to send its children to a Jewish school no matter what. Right? And it's not like it's going to reach the point that it's too expensive, so I'm going to enroll them in Thornhill Collegiate or something like that. Even if I lived in Thornhill, I wouldn't do that. So yeah, I'm committed. If it'll cost me a little bit more money, so I'll have to give up something else. You know, my lavish lifestyle, you know, there are plenty of things I can cut, you know. So I'll give up something and I'll pay a little more. But that's really the part I don't want anyone to see. But, okay. But, on the other hand, there are people who are less committed for whom this makes a difference. Will they give their kids a Jewish education, or will they not give their kids a Jewish education? And if the subsidies somehow could be directed to a greater extent to those individuals who are not in the system, as an inducement to put their kids into the system, we'd be saving kids. But otherwise it'd be lost. So the same money could subsidize the Breitowitz family budget, or it could be used to save people that would be lost to Judaism. What's a better use of the money?
Depends who you ask.
Depends who you ask. No, even I will admit, right, that it's a better use of the money, right, to use it as an inducement to get kids into the system that otherwise wouldn't get a Jewish education. So the question is, if you'd ask me, if I think about my own personal situation, my own narrow set of concerns, then of course, this is the best possible thing. If I have a little bit of a broader picture, I see it's not so simple. Now, when you take the broader picture, there are different concerns. And the consequences of actions are different. In other words, right now, within my narrow box, the consequence of my tuition being subsidized by Federation means I have more money I can spend on this, on that, which is nice. It's nice to have less pressure and more cash on hand and so on and so forth. I can live more comfortably, more pleasantly. But on the other hand, right, the real consequence of my getting that subsidy may be that there are kids that will not get a Jewish education, which means essentially they'll be lost to the Jewish people forever. God forbid. But it may be the case. So this is the question. It's not a question of whether you look at consequences or you don't look at consequences. The question is, how narrow is your scope, or how broad is your scope? Because we're dealing with a situation over here. The Jews are involved. It's a very complex political situation. The Roman government, the Jewish government, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't take too much provocation to bring the Romans in a very, very destructive way, where the Romans, to show their strength, will crush a little city called Jerusalem. It's not hard to envision. Right? Keep in mind, this is the Roman Empire. We're talking about a veritable bulldozer of conquest. And what are Reb Chaim ben Avkulas's concerns? They are concerns that people should not have a misconception about a fine point of Jewish law, which is important, by the way. I'm not minimizing that. Because we don't want that the Torah should be falsified. We don't want people to have a misconception about Jewish law. People should not think that a blemished animal is a valid sacrifice, and they shouldn't think that a person who causes a blemish is liable for the death penalty. Yes?
Who would have found out about it? Who would have known? How would it be? I mean, if they brought a sacrifice with a blemish.
How they know?
I mean, Bar Kamsa would have told if they didn't bring the sacrifice, Bar Kamsa would have went to tell.
There's a story that they say that Napoleon was curious what the Jews were saying about him. So he asked his advisors that, what are the Jews saying about me? So one of the advisors says, I can't tell you what they're saying, but Jews talk politics in the mikveh. So if you go to the mikveh, you'll hear what they're saying. It's a good idea. So Napoleon next morning goes to the mikveh. And the old Balti are sitting there, and he asks one of them, says, tell me, he says, what are the Jews saying about Napoleon? So an old man says, ich weiß nicht. I don't know. But I hear, as kommt in the mikveh, he's coming to the mikveh today. So, word gets out. Word gets out. That's everyone knows what's going on. So the point of Chaim ben Avkulas is that, yes, he was a person who was concerned for consequences. But his scope was much too narrow. His area of concern was just, the within the Haredish community, right? What are people going to say about this fine point of Jewish law? Which again, I'm not belittling, it's an important point, but it pales in significance to the broader issue, which is the Jewish nation going to survive as an independent entity, or will be crushed by the Roman Empire, bringing the destruction to the Beis Hamikdash and Golus, exile, and all that entails.
So is this one of the reasons we have prayer for Venus and Das and this one asteroid?
Well, intelligence helps. You need the intelligence thing. But this is the point of the Gemara. The point of the Gemara is that it's not enough to think of consequences. You have to think of the broader picture. You have to think of the real consequence. And this may be something that we have to really think about. When we talk about the length of Golus. Now, Klal Yisrael has been in Golus for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And for all this time, we've been praying for Mashiach to come and bring the redemption and so on and so forth. And now it seems there's been a return to the land of Israel, but it seems to a certain extent that the religious community has abdicated the role that it could play in nation building. Now, I don't want to lecture about Israeli politics, but I'm going to give you a short lesson in political science, a little tidbit of information that's important to know. When you talk about representation in a parliament or in a Congress, so there are two types of representation. There could be district representation, such as we have here in Canada. In other words, there are ridings, there are districts, and each district sends a representative to the parliament. Or you have the system that Israel has, which is a system of proportionate representation, where there's no separate districts. There's one single national electorate, and the seats in the parliament are divided proportionately by the various parties. So let's say, for example, Israel, the Knesset has 120 seats. Let's say, for simplicity's sake, let's say it has 100 seats. So any party that gains 1% of the vote wins a seat. It's a little more complex than that, but for simplicity's sake, that's the idea. So if Kadima gets 20% of the vote, they'll get 20 seats. And if Likud gets 30% of the vote, they'll get 30 seats. In other words, it's proportionally divided. So the little tidbit in political science is like this. In countries that have proportionate representation, the tendency is to splinter into small political parties. And in countries that have district representation, the tendency is to coalesce into large political parties. Now, do you need to understand why that is? It's very simple. Think about it for a second.
You want to get more?
Let's say in Israel, proportionate representation. I'm an ambitious politician. I'd like to be in the Knesset. So I'm a member of the Kadima party, and Kadima says, you've been a faithful member of the party. We're going to put you on our list, so that if you get enough votes, you'll get a seat. Oh, very nice, thank you. What number on the list will I be? You'll be number 87 on the list.
Right.
That means that if we get 87% of the vote, you'll get a seat. But if it's short of that, then you realize that the list, it's a kavod. It's an honor, but it's an honor which doesn't mean anything. Because there's no likelihood that the party will get more than 20, 30, 40% of the... So what should I do if I want to get a seat? I start my own party. It says, whatever my platform is, whatever my interest is, I certainly can find 1% of the Meshugoyim to agree with me, right? So, you can have a party, the marijuana party, right? So for 1% of the people, marijuana is such a burning issue, forgive the pun, such a burning issue, that they'll vote for the person who's the head of the marijuana party. Or they'll vote for this, or the pensioners party, or whatever it is, right? So therefore that's the tendency. In other words, when you have proportionate representation, right, I'm not going to get the 87th seat in a major party, but I might get the number 1 position in a minor party. So the tendency is that you have many, many splinter parties forming, and now you have a problem. That no one party in an election wins a majority. So how do you form a government? Coalition. Now the horse trading begins, right? So the larger parties now have to bring these splinter parties into the coalition, and they demand a price. And they say, listen, says, we understand this is not important to you, but this is very important to us. So therefore, if you want our votes, you will make our platform part of your platform. So let's say, for example, Likud has the largest number of seats, and they've been asked to form a government, but they desperately need the marijuana party. So the marijuana party will say, listen, we'll join you, but you have to make this a plank in your platform, something that you'll insist upon when you're in power. And that's really how it works. So in a country like Canada, we have district representation. It doesn't work that way, right? If I form my own party and I get 1% of the vote in my district, I'm not going to accomplish anything. I have to align with a major party, and therefore there's a coattail effect. If nationally the Labour Party or the Conservatives have forward momentum, they'll sweep me along with them. So that's the tendency, right? That in countries where you have district representation, the parties coalesce to form large parties. Proportional representation, they splinter to form small parties. The fact that Israel has this system, by the way, is a carryover of the Zionist congresses before the state. You see, in the Zionist congresses, there couldn't be district representation because there were no districts to represent. Right? It was all ideological party differences. And when they started the state, since really the way the machinery of the state essentially was the machinery of the Zionist movement took over the state, so it just followed the same practice as before, and they had the proportional representation. That's why Israel has this very odd system that it has. Now, the religious parties are those splinter parties, right? And they are essentially one-issue parties. Their issue is to advance religious concerns, which is very fine. It's as legitimate as any single-issue party. And that means like this. It says we're not interested in the economy in particular. We're not interested in foreign policy. We're not interested in military policy. It says we will sell our votes to anybody who is willing to embrace our concerns, which is what splinter parties do, right? So what are the religious parties' issues? Religious observance, funding of religious institutions, and so on and so forth, right? Now the truth is that it seems to me, and maybe this is a little controversial, that there's a certain amount of, let's just call it Golus mentality here, right? Whereas when Jews lived in Golus, when they lived in exile, they lived in Poland, they lived in Russia, they lived in Germany, wherever they lived, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all these countries. So, the government would do what the government does. In other words, they weren't there to serve the Jews, they weren't interested in what the Jews had to say, and so on and so forth. The interest of the Jews was advancing Jewish interests. And I think that's true. When Jews are in Golus, when Jews are in exile, that should be first and foremost. In other words, the Jews are not going to influence the foreign policy or the economic policy of a country where they are a small minority. But at least they can do their best to lobby and to influence and to involve themselves in some type of statesmanship in order to advance their particular parochial needs. That makes a lot of sense. But in Israel, should it be that way? I think you can make a very strong case that this Golus mentality ultimately reduces the influence that people of Torah should have. The Torah has plenty to say on issues of the economy and issues of the military and issues of foreign relations. Everything is there. But if you withdraw and you step back and you say that we're not involved, we're not interested in involving ourselves in the life of the country, the life of the state, in serving the state, serving the military, etc. We're only interested in our local parochial concerns. So therefore, you're almost guaranteeing that the state, in a general sense, will be Torah-less. And we're only protecting our thing, our little area of concern. One second. So I'm saying it's like this: the types of decisions you make, the types of policies you pursue in that instance, maybe very, very, very good ones within your little box, so to speak, within your little area of concern. But they may be very negative in terms of the broad national picture. In other words, if you sell your vote to the party whose positions on defense, on foreign relations, on the economy are not so good, so maybe, you've advanced your private concerns. Your institutions will be funded, and laws that relate to religious coercion won't be passed, and etc. So you think you did great things. But in reality, it's a failure of foresight. It's like Uschayven of Kulas. It's a concern with the narrow area and consequences of decisions within the narrow area, and a failure to look at the broader area, which makes difference in the life of the nation as a whole. And this is what the Gemara is telling us. The Gemara is telling us that causes churban. That causes churban. And it might be that it not only causes churban, it may perpetuate churban. Right? It may perpetuate the matzav. Because if we don't show that the people of Torah are ready to take responsibility for having a nation, then the status quo is perpetuated. It doesn't get any better. Yes?
Prime Minister.
But going back to the formation of Israel, the Haredi community started then. They abdicated.
That's what I'm saying. I'm
right.
I'm offering a gentle critique.
So I understand. But I've been very frustrated for a long time. So I'm glad you brought up the subject. The point is, though, at the time of the Gemara, we have one individual who seemed to be somewhat short-sighted, as you're suggesting. In the modern era, so to speak, the 20th century, it's not one individual. It's many Rabbeim who, there's no leader, so they could have. No, I understand. My 30 seconds.
You got the point. Okay. You got the point. So, and this thing is this, that we have to begin to think of broader consequences. That's really the issue. Those broader consequences, seeing that our decisions do not only have consequences for our own private communities, but have consequences for the nation as a whole. Or what may be a positive consequence for our private community, may be a negative consequence for the nation as a whole. That is something that has to be really one of the lessons of Tish Jul.
How is it that so many learned Rabbeim ignore this fact?
I have to tell you the truth, that I've been around long enough to suspect that it doesn't work exactly as you describe it. In other words, despite the fact that religious parties pay lip service to the idea that we rely on our rabbis and we listen to everything they say and so on and so forth, it really is not that way. Really, politics has a life of its own. And people pay lip service to the idea of obedience and we follow our rabbinic authority and so on and so forth. But the reality is that it's not. There's a very interesting book. I won't tell you the title of the book or the author of the book, but I own a copy. If you are interested in reading it, I can lend it to you. It's Hebrew, very, very modern Hebrew. It's a tough book to read, which essentially follows the history of one of the religious parties, one of the major religious parties, and shows that its claim to follow rabbinic authority is totally false. Right? That consistently, it has been led by the professional politicians, right? Contrary to the to the authority of the rabbis that it claims leader.
But the authorities can step up and say, we are withdrawing from this. We are separating ourselves from what's to stop them doing it.
You know, it's a tough question. You know, maybe that's part of the discussion too. But I think that you know the central control of rabbinic leadership is sometimes greatly exaggerated. You know, politics has a life of its own. Politicians have lives of their own.
But when you say that on principle, I mean, my feeling is that on principle, I've heard this from my Haredi relatives, right, in Bnei Brak and Yerushalayim. On principle, they've narrowed their scope. In other words, they purposely say, we're only concerned with this little box. We don't care about the Oslo Agreement. We don't care about the defense situations, the decision to pull out of Gush Katif and all this kind of stuff. We're just here for Torah. It's not our business. Mashiach is not here. And this is not our concern.
Isn't that what the Gemara is talking about? Isn't that what the whole sugya here in Gittin is talking about? The Schreiber Nakula said, listen, we don't have to worry about the Roman Empire and the broader picture, right? Let's worry about whether within our community people will understand the halacha of blemished korbanos properly, right? That's the whole point of the Gemara.
That's the whole problem.
Right? I'm just reading a Gemara. I don't know. There's another pshat in the Gemara. You know, they tell a story about a person who decided he was going to build a house based on Talmudic principles. Right? So, you know, he didn't study architecture, didn't study engineering. He's going to build a house on Talmudic principles. So he built a house, and the house collapsed. So they said, how did the house collapse? So I thought it was based on Talmudic principles. So he says, Tish asked that question. You know, but I think that sometimes we have to read the Gemara. Sometimes the Talmudic principles are more wise than we give them credit for. Oh, that's a little bit of a thought going into Tisha B'Av on this famous Gemara, Bez Hashem, easy fast.